Karen thought she could park wherever she wanted, trampling years of sweat and boundaries. But when she returned to my farm this time, I didn't just wait. I acted. By the end of the day, her SUV was dangling from my oak tree, and the entire neighborhood witnessed her shock. The farm had always existed in a kind of quiet rhythm, shaped by early mornings, warm dust, and the familiar groan of old machinery waking with the sun. Generations before me had worked this land, and I had grown up understanding its rules, its needs, and its boundaries better than I understood most people. Out here, space was respected the same way neighbors were. From a polite distance, with clear lines, and with the understanding that a person's land was an extension of their dignity. Which is why the first time I found the silver SUV sitting in the middle of my hay turnout, the absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. It was positioned perfectly between the fence posts, as if someone had deliberately studied the geography of my farm and chosen the exact spot that disrupted everything. Tire tracks cut through soil I had spent days grading, and the smell of crushed alfalfa lingered in the air like an insult. At that moment I assumed it was some tourist who got lost, mistook the open gate as an invitation, and planned to turn around momentarily. But as the hours passed and the vehicle remained parked with a kind of smug permanence, the situation shifted from puzzling to irritating. I had fields to prep, equipment to move, and no interest in navigating around someone's thoughtless decisions. The second time the SUV appeared on my property, it was parked even deeper inside, next to my irrigation controls. The sun glinted off its polished roof as if it had arrived to challenge everything I considered orderly and reasonable. And unlike lost tourists, this driver felt oddly confident, too confident. Parking on land she clearly didn't know WNWY the third intrusion. The gate had been chained, the path blocked with barrels, and signs posted in bold letters. Yet somehow, against all logic, the SUV returned again, this time overnight. It sat there in the morning like a parasite attached to a living host, interrupting the natural flow of everything around it. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't an accident. This was entitlement. And there was one person in the nearby residential edge who radiated that level of boldness. A woman known by the neighborhood as something between a social menace and a self-appointed rule enforcer. Her name was whispered with a mix of frustration and dread. Her behavior was the kind that created stories neighbors retold for years. Relentless nitpicking, habitual complaining, and a professional-level aptitude for conflict. She had a nickname everyone used quietly, Karen of the North Fence. Her property bordered a thin slice of my land where the residential development crept too close for comfort. Before the houses existed, the area had been open pasture. After the developers arrived, fences went up, concrete replaced grass, and people who had never set foot on a farm decided they knew how the countryside should operate. Karen was the queen of that kingdom, armed with a clipboard, a phone always ready to record, and a voice that carried across fields like a weather alarm. She had been known to lecture delivery drivers, measure grass height on neighbors' lawns, and confront teenagers for having unapproved friends over. Parking her SUV on private farmland was almost mild by her standards. Still, her boldness left a mark on my daily operations. I found myself circling around her parked vehicle with my tractor, adjusting hay patterns, delaying plans, and losing entire mornings of productivity. Each time I encountered that SUV, it seemed to sit there with a kind of smug defiance, daring me to react. But I wasn't a reactive man. Farming requires patience, foresight, and planning. Traits Karen didn't possess, so I watched. I waited. I documented every pattern, every entry point she exploited, every time she ignored barriers that were impossible to miss. And gradually an idea began to take shape, not impulsive, not aggressive, but strategic. Something that wouldn't damage her property, wouldn't violate any laws, wouldn't escalate beyond control, yet would deliver a message so unmistakable that even someone with her extraordinary density of entitlement would understand. The SUV started appearing 3 times a week, then 4. If she needed space, she had a driveway. If she needed overflow parking, there were visitor spots by the neighborhood entrance. But she chose my land. Not because she needed it, but because she believed she could. Because to her, boundaries were suggestions meant for other people. The breaking point came on a warm, Windless afternoon when I found her SUV parked directly in front of the livestock loading area, blocking the ramp at the exact moment I had a delivery scheduled. The driver of the livestock transport truck stared at the vehicle in confusion, unable to complete his job. The delay cost me money, time, and patience. This wasn't simply an inconvenience anymore. This was someone stepping into my world without permission and reshaping it around their ego. That night, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky bled orange across the property, I walked through the fields with my flashlight, looking at the tire marks, the flattened grass, and the scuffed earth left behind by her repeated visits. And by the time I returned to the barn, the plan had crystallized fully. It was time to teach someone who believed herself above all consequences what it meant to trespass on land owned by someone who wasn't afraid to protect it. Not through anger, not through threats, but through a display of simple, unapologetic consequences, delivered with the quiet precision of a man who knows exactly how to operate heavy machinery. And the machinery in question, my old farm tractor, strong, durable, capable, far taller than her SUV, and equipped with chains that could lift far more weight than that polished, entitled metal box. The farm didn't need confrontation. It needed balance restored. And the SUV? Well, it needed elevation. The next morning arrived with the quiet confidence only a farmer understands. The world outside was still damp with early dew, and the air carried that crisp, earthy scent that settles over the land before the heat rises. I moved through the farm with practiced familiarity, checking fences, feeding livestock, and preparing the tractor long before anyone in the residential cul-de-sac had even silenced their alarms. That tractor had been in my family longer than some houses in the neighborhood had existed. It was an old, steel-framed beast, built during a time when machinery was expected to outlive the people who operated it. Its engine didn't purr, it growled. Its tires didn't roll, they anchored. And when I fired it up, the entire ground trembled with the deep, resonant hum of a machine built for serious work. And that morning, work was exactly what waited for it. It didn't take long for the silver SUV to reappear, parked with a kind of theatrical arrogance in the exact spot I had cleared the night before. It sat there like a dare, positioned between my fence line and the loading gate as if she had carefully chosen the most inconvenient location possible. Its fresh tire tracks cut through the soil in smooth curves, telling me everything I needed to know. She wasn't trying to hide what she was doing. She was flaunting it. To her, my farm wasn't land. It wasn't livelihood. It wasn't years of investment and sweat and exhaustion. It was simply unused space. Space that she believed she deserved. But today she had parked early. And today she had parked in the wrong spot. The livestock hauler was scheduled to arrive in less than an hour. The SUV blocked the only clear path large enough for the truck to maneuver. If the driver arrived and couldn't load, it would cost me not only time but additional fees. Karen's inconsiderate parking had crossed a line I no longer intended to tolerate. That I had tried locking the gates. She moved the barrels. I had posted signs. She ignored them. I had spoken with a deputy. They said unless she damaged something or I physically confronted her, there was little they could do quickly. So I would solve the problem myself. Legally, calmly, and with the tools I owned. The tractor idled behind the barn as I prepared the rigging. Heavy-duty chains, thick as my wrist, could be used for lifting lumber, hoisting equipment, or dragging felled trees from the ravine. They were rated for far more weight than her 2-ton SUV. I lifted them into the tractor's bucket and secured them with a kind of practiced ease that only years of farm labor could produce. Nothing I planned would damage her vehicle. Nothing would scratch the paint. Nothing would cause a single dent. But it would send a message she would never forget. When the tractor rounded the corner and rumbled into full view of the silver SUV, a strange calm settled over the property. The sun glinted against the hood, and the windshield reflected the sky like a defiant stare. But the vehicle was still, silent, empty, perfect. I maneuvered the tractor into position behind the SUV and lowered the bucket, the metal plates groaning softly. The chain uncoiled like a serpent, each heavy link clanking in rhythmic metallic echoes. I slipped the loops around the SUV's rear axle housing, carefully, methodically, with precision. This was not vandalism. This was relocation. And relocation is not a crime. With everything secured, I climbed back into the tractor's seat. The engine's growl deepened, pulsing through the frame beneath me. I eased the hydraulic lever forward, and the bucket lifted slowly, so slowly I could hear the faint tension tightening in the chains. Then the weight shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. The SUV began to rise 0.2 inches, 0.6 inches, 0.12 inches. The tires left the ground with a reluctant bounce, and suddenly the polished, arrogant vehicle looked absurdly vulnerable, dangling just below the bucket of a machine that could carry an entire bale stack without strain. I drove slowly, steadily, toward an old oak tree that stood in the center of my property long before the neighborhood ever existed, its branches twisted outwards with age and pride. Sturdy enough to carry tools, hoist equipment, and, today, teach someone a lesson in respecting boundaries that I didn't lift the SUV high just enough to suspend it safely above the ground, about 1.5 feet up. High enough that anyone looking at it would freeze. Low enough that it wouldn't strain the chains. Once it was positioned perfectly, I lowered the bucket until the chain's weight transferred to the overhead limb I had reinforced years earlier for farm rigging. The SUV hung there like a bizarre ornament, safe, undamaged, but undeniably, unignorably elevated. From the edge of the residential fence line, the first heads appeared. Neighbors, residents. Onlookers drawn by the sound of machinery and the sight of a vehicle dangling in the air. Their expressions moved through a spectrum of disbelief. Shock, confusion, curiosity. More appeared, phones in hand, cameras pointed. Not a single person approached to question what they witnessed. They simply stared, whispering among themselves, stunned by the unfolding spectacle. But the moment that truly marked the shift, the moment the entire situation transcended from irritation to inevitable confrontation, came a few minutes later, when the silver SUV's rightful owner stepped outside. Karen. Clipboard carrier, boundary disregarder. Parking rule tyrant. Crossed arm champion. She froze, dead still, her eyes widened with incomprehension as she stared at her SUV hanging calmly from my oak tree like a metallic swing. All the power she believed she had, her confidence, her entitlement, her assumed dominance drained from her face in an instant. She wasn't storming. She wasn't shrieking, she was simply silent. Her SUV was airborne. The neighbors watched her reaction with quiet fascination, and I stood beside the tractor calm, steady, collected, ready for the day's consequence. Because consequences were exactly what she had delivered to me for months. Now they had simply returned to her. For a long moment, the farm felt frozen in time. The tractor's engine clicked softly as it cooled. The chain swayed gently from the branch, and the suspended SUV cast a strange, perfectly shaped shadow across the dusty ground. But the stillness didn't last, because Karen finally processed what she was looking at. Her disbelief transformed into something volatile. Her steps became rapid, sharp, fueled by a mixture of shock, panic, and a level of indignation only a true HOA warrior could muster. She marched across the property line as though the soil beneath her feet belonged to her. Ignoring fences, ignoring boundaries, ignoring the fact that every trespassing step was witnessed by half the neighborhood. The residents along the fence watched from behind patio rails and open windows, their silent curiosity widening into full fascination. They knew Karen well. They had seen her fine people for garden gnomes, write warnings for grass too enthusiastic, and lecture grown adults about mailbox uniformity. But none of them had ever seen her in a situation she wasn't fully in control of. And now she was staring up at her prized SUV swinging lightly in the breeze, powerless to do anything about it. As she stopped beneath the oak tree, she craned her neck upward, eyes flaring, chest heaving, hands balled into trembling fists. Her SUV wasn't damaged. It wasn't scratched. It wasn't even tilted dangerously. But it was undeniably inaccessible, suspended just high enough off the ground that no ladder, no stool, no clever maneuver could get her inside. The vehicle she weaponized against parking rules was now hanging like a warning sign. She looked around wildly, as if waiting for someone to step forward, declare this unacceptable, and demand justice on her behalf. But the neighbors didn't speak. They simply observed. Some recorded. Others covered their mouths to hide smirks. Not a single person rushed to her support. She wasn't used to that. She was used to obedience. She was used to people fearing the clipboard she carried everywhere. Today, her clipboard was useless. She paced in tight circles around the oak tree, analyzing the situation with frantic calculation. Her eyes traced the chain, the branch, the tractor tracks leading to the lifting point. She seemed to be searching for some detail she could use as ammunition, some way to twist the scenario into victimhood or rule violation. But she found none. Because nothing I had done broke a single law. The SUV wasn't damaged. Her trespassing was recorded by multiple neighbors. And every inch of ground she was standing on belonged to me. Legally, fully, undeniably. As her frustration built, she turned toward the fence. The audience of silent residents made her expression tighten further. Her outrage wasn't landing. Her indignation found no traction. And the more she realized her social authority meant nothing out here, the more unsteady she became. A sudden rustling of leaves drew her attention back to the hanging vehicle. A light gust of wind swayed the SUV just enough to make the chains creak overhead. It wasn't a dangerous movement, but to Karen, it shattered what remained of her composure. She flinched backward like the vehicle might break free and lunge at her. Her confidence cracked. Her mask slipped. And for the first time since she had moved into the neighborhood, she looked genuinely small. She stormed toward my boundary line. Her footsteps stabbing the soil with the weight of her fury, and marched directly into the cluster of watching neighbors. Their phones followed her movements like quiet, unblinking witnesses. Her energy radiated outward in a chaotic spiral, collecting tension like a storm forming out of thin air. When the first HOA board member hurried toward her from the street, the reaction was immediate. Residents murmured. Some backed up. Others angled their phones for a better recording. They knew drama when they saw it, and this was about to escalate beyond anything the neighborhood had ever witnessed. The board member reached her with an expression torn between confusion and dread. He took in the hanging SUV with wide eyes, his posture stiffening in horror as he realized what had happened. His shoulders drooped slightly, not because he felt empathy for Karen, but because he understood what kind of chaos she was about to unleash. He gestured to the neighbors, to the property lines, to the oak tree, and finally to the tractor parked innocently beside the barn. There was no path for blame. No violación committed. No rule broken. The farm was undeniably private land, and the SUV was undeniably parked where it didn't belong. Karen refused to accept it. She spun back toward the oak tree, breathing hard, her outrage growing with every passing second. Her entire posture radiated a singular, consuming thought. She needed someone to blame, someone to punish, someone to hold responsible for the humiliation unfolding in real time. Her gaze finally locked onto the farmhouse in the distance, the only structure on the land she didn't control, the only place connected to the tractor, the only person she could target. She stormed toward it. She didn't care that she was marching deeper into private property. She didn't care that neighbors were filming her trespass. She didn't care that her SUV hung above her head like a symbol of her own stubbornness. She needed to assert dominance. She needed to regain control. She needed to remind herself she still held power somewhere. But what she didn't understand, what she could not possibly predict, was that the more she pushed, the deeper she stepped into consequences she could never walk back from. The land she was trespassing on had protections. The farm she was invading was legally documented. And the decisions she made next would permanently reshape the fate of her HOA. The tractor sat still. The SUV swayed lightly. The neighbors watched with widening eyes. Karen had started a fight she could no longer win. And the storm she tried to unleash was about to turn directly back on her. The morning after the SUV hung from the oak tree, the farm hummed with quiet authority. The sun's early rays illuminated the silver vehicle, swaying gently with the breeze, casting long, distorted shadows across the flattened grass. Every neighbor in the cul-de-sac had witnessed something extraordinary, something they would whisper about for months. Karen's audacity had collided directly with consequences she could not control. From her front porch, Karen stared at her vehicle with disbelief. Her expressions shifted rapidly. Shock, fear, indignation, and finally the undeniable recognition that she was powerless. For years, She had marched through life assuming entitlement over anyone or anything that crossed her path. Today, that assumption shattered. The SUV, lifted off the ground by a simple tractor, transformed from a symbol of convenience to a monument of accountability. I moved through the fields, surveying the land, noting the tire tracks, the churned dirt, and the impressions left by repeated intrusions. Every detail reinforced the message. Boundaries were real. Land ownership was real, and disrespect carried consequences. My patience, once tested and ignored, had manifested into a lesson more visible than any conversation or written notice could ever convey. The presence of neighbors, silently observing from their fences and windows, intensified the moment. Their phones and cameras captured the spectacle in real time, their fascination a reflection of the absurdity and drama of the situation. Karen's reputation, built on the illusion of dominance and authority within the HOA, began to unravel in plain sight. Power, it seemed, depended entirely on perception. And perception, in this case, had shifted irrevocably. As the hours passed, Karen attempted subtle maneuvers to reclaim some sense of control, measuring the chains, analyzing the position of the tractor, and pacing in tight circles around the oak tree. Yet every movement was futile. The SUV was suspended securely, the chains holding firm, the oak branch strong and unyielding. The farm's machinery, my tools, and my meticulous planning were all aligned perfectly. Nature, property rights, and preparation had created an immovable force against her overreach. The psychological impact on her was unmistakable. Every attempt to assert dominance, every glance at the swinging vehicle, magnified her realization that she had miscalculated. Her entitlement collided violently with reality. What she considered trivial, parking in someone else's yard, had been transformed into a visual, undeniable lesson in consequences. The irony was tangible. She had weaponized her vehicle against the world, only to have it turned into a silent teacher of accountability. Meanwhile, the surrounding neighborhood experienced a subtle shift. Whispered conversations, exchanged glances, and carefully recorded footage spread rapidly. Karen's aura of invincibility, long upheld by HOA titles and social fear, dissolved. The spectacle of the SUV suspended in midair became a viral tableau, a modern-day parable for every homeowner confronted by a persistent, entitled neighbor. Legal consequences lingered in the background, even if they hadn't been formally initiated yet. The tractor, the chains, and the deliberate placement of the vehicle had been executed with care to avoid property damage or liability. Each precaution reflected a strategy beyond impulsive retaliation. This was measured, precise, and above all, indisputable. Karen had been provided the ultimate lesson without the slightest breach of law, yet her public humiliation was complete. By late afternoon, the SUV remained aloft. Its owner no longer moved freely around it. Every step she took was calculated, hesitant, aware that every neighbor could witness her predicament. Her former confidence had eroded into anxious calculation. The once dominant figure of the HOA hierarchy now contorted herself around a reality she couldn't command. The farm had reclaimed its territory. Order had been restored not by confrontation, but by ingenuity and foresight. As the shadows lengthened across the property, a new awareness settled over Karen. Her actions had repercussions beyond fines or verbal warnings. The chains, the tractor, the oak tree, they were reminders of the limits of entitlement. And for anyone observing from the edge of the cul-de-sac, the message was equally clear. Respect private property, or the consequences will manifest in ways they cannot ignore. The stage was now set for the next chapter. Karen's pride had been punctured, her authority visibly undermined, and her entitlement confronted directly by both the land and the law of preparation. While the SUV swayed silently above the ground, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had shifted permanently. The drama was far from over, yet the balance of power had begun to tilt, quietly, inevitably, and irreversibly. The day after the SUV had been suspended from the oak tree, the atmosphere on the farm carried a quiet tension, like the pause before a storm. Karen's presence was more obvious than ever. She prowled along the fence line, scanning for ways to reclaim control, plotting her next move, all while keeping the rest of the neighborhood entertained. Every neighbor who had witnessed the previous day's spectacle whispered about her audacity, shaking their heads at the irony of her predicament. She believed that retaliation would restore her dominance. What she failed to realize was that every step she took on my land, every frantic calculation of how to fix the situation, only tightened the web of consequences around her. Her attempts to consult with HOA members, to call legal counsel, or to issue ultimatums were met with quiet disbelief. The story of the dangling SUV had already spread, and public opinion leaned heavily against her. I spent the morning inspecting the chains and the branch, ensuring everything remained perfectly balanced. Every precaution was deliberate. This was no impulsive act of anger, but a calculated demonstration of boundaries and respect. The vehicle's suspension was flawless, a testament to the planning and precision that I had applied to every detail. Meanwhile, Karen's frustration radiated visibly, her energy crackling across the property like static in the air. Her attempts to summon allies backfired spectacularly. HOA members, who had previously followed her lead unquestioningly, began to hesitate. Some offered cautious suggestions, while others retreated entirely, unwilling to be caught in the spectacle of her miscalculated vengeance. Her carefully constructed image of authority, long built on intimidation and rule enforcement, crumbled under the quiet observation of neighbors who had now seen the limits of her influence. By mid-afternoon, Karen's actions grew more desperate. She attempted to place temporary barriers, erecting cones and makeshift warning signs, as if these could undo the consequences of her repeated trespasses. Every movement she made, every frantic gesture, only reinforced the narrative of a person unaccustomed to accountability. The SUV hung silently above the ground, a symbol of restraint and planning, yet it dominated every visual frame of her frantic efforts. The surrounding neighborhood responded quietly but powerfully. Phones were raised, conversations whispered, and the spectacle spread through social media in real time. Karen's image as an untouchable figure within the HOA hierarchy suffered a public and permanent crack. Her entitlement, once reinforced by fear and authority, now became the subject of ridicule, shared far beyond the cul-de-sac where the events unfolded. By the late afternoon, Karen exhausted her options. Every effort to manipulate, intimidate, or regain perceived dominance failed. The boundaries she had ignored for so long had been reinforced with both ingenuity and precision, leaving her unable to move forward without acknowledging the consequences. The land, the machinery, and the meticulous planning had united against her actions, creating a spectacle that no verbal argument or legal threat could reverse. In the quiet aftermath, I watched as she finally retreated to her property line, shoulders slumped, her gaze unwillingly drawn to the dangling SUV. The neighborhood exhaled collectively, sensing the shift in power. For the first time, Karen had been confronted with a reality she could not control. Her entitlement had collided with preparation, patience, and the clear authority of private property. While the SUV remained suspended above the ground, it was more than a vehicle. It had become a statement. Boundaries could not be ignored, and actions have consequences. Karen's attempts at retaliation had only cemented the lesson. The farm's integrity was preserved, the land respected, and the message clear. Interference carried tangible repercussions. The stage was now set for the final chapter. Karen's authority had eroded, her retaliation had failed, and the neighborhood had witnessed a spectacle that would become legend. The conclusion would not require confrontation. It would be a quiet assertion of boundaries, reinforced through visible consequence, leaving a permanent reminder of respect, planning, and the inevitability of accountability. By the sixth day, the farm had settled into an unusual calm. The oak tree's branches creaked softly in the breeze, holding the silver SUV aloft, a silent monument to consequences delivered with precision. Neighbors lingered at the edges of their lawns, peering through fences, capturing videos, and whispering about the spectacle that had unfolded over the week. Karen's audacity had not disappeared, but her authority had been irreversibly undermined. Each morning, she would appear at the fence line, carefully observing her suspended vehicle, hesitation etched across her face. Every attempt to assert dominance had been neutralized by strategy, patience, and preparation. Her SUV, untouched yet immovable, was a physical manifestation of boundaries enforced without malice, but with unmistakable clarity. Her entitlement had met the immovable force of responsibility. The farm, however, had returned to its natural rhythm. Cows grazed quietly in the fields, tractors rumbled along their usual paths, and machinery hummed in the background. While the spectacle of the SUV drew attention, it did not disrupt the essential flow of life on the land. Work continued, demonstrating that authority rooted in preparation and ownership was far more enduring than the fleeting power of entitlement. Karen's repeated attempts to involve the HOA and local authorities yielded nothing. Reports, complaints, and ultimatums were rendered impotent against documented trespassing and careful planning. Legal scrutiny only confirmed that every precaution had been taken to avoid damage or injury, leaving her position increasingly untenable. The community, once silent observers, began to appreciate the lesson being illustrated. Boundaries are not suggestions, and trespass carries consequences. By midweek, a subtle shift had taken place among the neighborhood residents. Conversations moved from curiosity to admiration for the measured approach used to enforce property rights. Phones captured images and videos, not for ridicule, but as a reference of how preparation, restraint, and careful execution could address repeated violations. Karen's humiliation was public, undeniable, and permanent. The suspended SUV became a teaching tool. Children watched it swing lightly in the wind, farmers smiled knowingly, and neighbors remarked on the precision and patience required to execute such a display. No threats had been issued, no damage had occurred. Yet the lesson was clear to anyone observing. Entitlement would not override ownership. Respect had been restored, quietly but irrevocably. Karen eventually ceased her attempts to interfere. Her visits became sporadic, her glances toward the property filled with resignation rather than aggression. The SUV remained, a silent symbol of her misjudgment and the farm's enduring authority. The boundaries were no longer in question. The lesson had been internalized, whether she acknowledged it or not. By the final day, the farm had reclaimed full control over its space. The neighborhood understood the hierarchy. Entitlement could challenge boundaries, but preparation, restraint, and decisiveness ensured respect. Karen's reputation within the HOA was diminished, her authority questioned, and her audacity permanently checked. The swinging SUV remained, not as a weapon, but as a testament to the efficacy of strategy over impulse. And as the sun set over the fields, casting long shadows across the farm, the land itself seemed to exhale. Balance had been restored. Authority had been asserted without cruelty. And the neighbors, quietly observing from their edges, knew they had witnessed a masterclass in consequence delivered with precision. The SUV would hang there as a reminder, the lesson engraved in every eye that had seen it. Trespassing has consequences, and entitlement will always meet accountability.